Maria receives threatening letter. Maria Trent thought moving to Willow Creek Estates would mean peace, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and no surprises. But one morning, she opened her mailbox to find a threatening HOA notice, a fine for overgrown grass on a lawn she hadn't even planted yet. Confused and angry, she tried to confront the HOA president, Harold Finch, but every attempt only drew more intimidation. And then she discovered something far worse: the HOA elections were rigged, and Harold would do anything to keep control. How far will one neighborhood go to protect or expose the truth? Maria Trent had moved to Willow Creek Estates 6 years ago, drawn by its manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and the promise of a quiet life. A petite woman in her late 30s, Maria always wore vibrant scarves and carried a sketchbook under her arm, a hint of her creative mind that contrasted sharply with the neighborhood's rigid conformity. Willow Creek Estates was run by a notoriously strict HOA, led by Harold Finch, a retired lawyer with a taste for control. Harold, in his mid-60s, was tall, precise, and always impeccably dressed. He thrived on enforcing arcane rules. Flower beds had to be aligned at exact distances, lawn grass could not exceed 2.5 inches, and even the type of welcome mat was regulated. For many, Harold's oversight was tolerable; for others, it felt suffocating. The tension began subtly. Maria noticed letters in her mailbox that were unnervingly specific: fines for overgrown ornamental grasses and excessive garden gnome placement. When she questioned neighbors, they whispered stories of threats, fines, and intimidation tactics. The upcoming HOA elections promised to change everything. Harold had grown complacent over the years, and a younger, progressive candidate, Victor Ramos, a tech entrepreneur with ideas for eco-friendly community spaces, was running against him. Maria, who preferred staying neutral, decided to attend the candidate meeting, but what she witnessed was unnerving. Harold seemed to know questions in advance, subtly intimidating residents, and even cozying up to a few undecided voters. Something didn't feel right. Little did Maria know, Harold's power wasn't just influence, it was manipulation. From hidden ballots to lost voter registrations, Harold had perfected a method of rigging elections without leaving an obvious trail. And this year, he had decided he couldn't let Victor Ramos win, setting the stage for a conflict that would shake Willow Creek Estates to its foundations. Maria Trent didn't realize how quickly a neighborhood could turn from peaceful to suffocating. After the initial threatening letter, she started noticing the HOA's presence everywhere, like shadows that never left. Small, seemingly innocuous things began to feel like traps. A neighbor complained that her mailbox was slightly crooked, and the next day, she received a formal notice citing non-compliance with aesthetic standards. Another letter accused her of inappropriate garden alignment, though her flower beds were planted exactly the way the HOA guidebook demanded. At first, she tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a bureaucratic error. But then the fines started stacking: $50 here, $75 there, and suddenly, it wasn't just annoying, it was financially burdensome. Each envelope from the HOA felt heavier than the last, the typewritten words colder, sharper. Maria began sharing her experiences with other residents, and the whispers she heard were chilling. Linda, the retired schoolteacher across the street, revealed that her own fines had totaled nearly $1,200 over the past year over minor infractions no one else seemed to notice. The neighborhood's tension began to spill over into everyday interactions. The HOA meetings, once dull and perfunctory, turned into arenas of subtle intimidation. Harold Finch, the HOA president, always sat at the head of the room, impeccably dressed, exuding control. He had a way of looking at residents that made them question their own sanity. Questions were deflected with precise legal jargon, appeals were delayed indefinitely, and any dissent was met with veiled threats: "We're just enforcing the rules, of course. I'd hate for anyone to face further penalties." Maria noticed patterns. Certain residents, usually the younger families who had tried to suggest changes or challenge fines, would receive multiple notices in quick succession. It wasn't coincidence. Harold was using fear to keep people quiet. And when she tried to speak up at a meeting, he interrupted, smiled that cold, rehearsed smile, and said, "Perhaps you're misinterpreting the bylaws. Let's discuss this privately." The subtle power play made her stomach twist. Determined not to be bullied, Maria began documenting everything. She took photographs of her property, timestamps of letters, and recordings of meetings. She even created a spreadsheet tracking all fines, their reasons, and patterns among residents. As she dug deeper, it became clear Harold's enforcement wasn't about rules at all, it was about control. He was creating a climate where no one dared challenge him, ensuring the HOA elections remained firmly in his grasp. The breaking point came one afternoon when Maria returned from work to find her small vegetable garden, her pride in escape, flagged with bright red notices stapled to each plant. Violation: unauthorized planting. Fine: $150. Her neighbors watched silently from across the street, some shaking their heads, others too afraid to intervene. Her hands trembled as she picked up the notices. This was more than unfair, it was personal. And then she overheard a conversation between two HOA board members in her neighbor's driveway. They were laughing about how Harold would handle Victor Ramos, the challenger in the upcoming election. Anger and fear collided. Maria knew she couldn't face this alone. She started reaching out to her neighbors, tentatively at first, sensing the same frustration mirrored in their eyes. Mrs. Kim, whose children had been reprimanded for leaving bicycles in the wrong spot, whispered, "He thinks he owns us, our yards, our homes, even our voices." Slowly, the coalition formed a quiet network of residents sharing evidence, strategizing, and finding courage in numbers. As they plotted, Harold escalated his tactics. Notices now included cryptic threats: failure to comply may result in further action, or repeated violations could be reported to legal authorities. One evening, Maria discovered a letter in her mailbox that seemed intentionally designed to frighten. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and unsigned. Inside was a detailed list of potential infractions she might commit in the next month, including imagined offenses like incorrect window decoration and excessive mailbox ornamentation. It was psychological warfare. The situation intensified when Maria attended a community meeting to demand accountability. Harold arrived early, placing folders on the table, his presence commanding. He opened the meeting by praising compliance and harmony, but the words rang hollow. When residents began asking questions, he dismissed them with a calm, surgical precision, deflecting accusations and subtly insulting anyone who challenged him. Maria felt a ripple of fear run through the room. Most people shrank under his gaze, but she held her ground. Every time Harold tried to pivot, she countered with facts, evidence, and examples from her growing spreadsheet. It was exhausting, and Maria began to notice the toll it took. She felt constantly watched, small interactions with neighbors now laced with tension. Every time she stepped outside, she wondered who would report her next violation. But she refused to back down. Her determination grew as more residents joined the cause, bringing their own stories, finds, and photographs. It became a collective effort, a neighborhood quietly bracing for confrontation. One pivotal night, Maria discovered the most shocking piece of evidence yet: hidden copies of ballots from the HOA election had been discarded or altered. Someone had meticulously gone through mail-in votes, removing those favoring Victor Ramos. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Harold wasn't just threatening residents, he was actively manipulating the system to maintain power. Maria knew that if this came to light, the election could be overturned, but she also knew it would make Harold dangerous. The stakes had shifted from petty fines to outright fraud. The tension peaked when Maria and a few trusted neighbors decided to confront Harold directly. They approached the HOA office late one evening, prepared with documentation and questions. As they walked toward the building, a sense of dread hung in the air. Would they be heard? Or would Harold use every trick in his arsenal to intimidate them, just like he had done countless times before? The doors loomed ahead, a symbol of the power he wielded and the battle that lay ahead. Just as they reached the entrance, the lights flickered inside, and a shadow moved across the office window. Maria felt her heart hammer in her chest. This was it, the point of no return. The confrontation was imminent, and the community's silent revolt was about to erupt. Would Harold finally be exposed, or would the neighborhood's hopes be crushed under his meticulously maintained control? And that's when the first shock hit. The day of the HOA election count arrived, and Willow Creek Estates was electric with tension. Residents gathered outside the community center, clutching folders, laptops, and photographs, proof of years of harassment, fines, and ballot manipulation. Maria Trent felt a mix of fear and determination. Every step toward the building reminded her of the countless times Harold Finch had undermined her, silenced neighbors, and orchestrated intimidation campaigns. Now, everything came to a head. Inside, the room was sterile but charged. Harold, immaculately dressed, sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, hands folded. A few board members shifted uneasily in their chairs, aware that the quiet rebellion outside was nothing to underestimate. Victor Ramos, standing tall and calm, caught Maria's eye. They had prepared for this moment meticulously, a complete audit of ballots, documented fines, and recordings of meetings where Harold's threats had been explicit. As the counting began, the first anomalies appeared. Ballots favoring Victor were missing or duplicated. Harold's confident smile faltered as Maria quietly began cross-referencing the spreadsheets she had compiled over weeks. Each discrepancy told a story: votes discarded, signatures altered, envelopes mysteriously lost. A hush fell over the room as Maria presented the first pieces of evidence, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "These are your records," she said, placing a folder in front of Harold. "The numbers don't match. The ballots have been tampered with." Harold's eyes narrowed. He attempted his usual deflection, citing procedural technicalities and vague bylaws. But this time, the room wasn't intimidated. Neighbors, once silent, now spoke up, one by one, recounting fines that were clearly punitive, threats that had crossed legal boundaries, and inconsistencies in how the rules were enforced. The weight of their voices combined into a chorus Harold had never faced before. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers, searching for a way to regain control. The tension escalated when one resident, Mrs. Kim, stepped forward with her children's folder, showing photographic evidence of her holiday decorations labeled a visual disturbance. The room collectively gasped at the absurdity. Maria watched Harold's face turn red, not with anger, but with panic. The perfect control he had exercised for years was slipping through his fingers. Then came the legal bombshell. Victor, having retained counsel for months, had prepared an emergency motion to invalidate any suspect ballots and request an official HOA audit. The lawyer entered the room quietly, laying out the evidence: multiple votes had been discarded intentionally, procedural rules violated, and fines misused as intimidation. Harold attempted to object, claiming authority as HOA president, but the mounting evidence left little room for defense. For the first time in years, he was vulnerable, completely exposed. Voices rose, emotions boiled, and the atmosphere became almost chaotic. Residents who had once avoided confrontation now openly demanded justice. Maria felt adrenaline surge. Every minute, every document, every photograph she had painstakingly collected was paying off. The momentum was hers. Harold, cornered and desperate, tried one final manipulation, threatening legal action against Maria personally, attempting to invoke fear. But Maria, confident and prepared, countered calmly, citing recorded statements, bylaws, and the fact that the law protected whistleblowers. Harold's usual dominance crumbled in the face of transparency and collective resolve. Finally, the ballots were recounted under strict supervision. The room fell silent as the final numbers were read aloud. Victor Ramos had won decisively. Applause erupted, some residents cheering, others wiping tears of relief. Maria exhaled deeply, her heart still racing, aware that the battle had not only been about an election, it had been about reclaiming dignity, fairness, and agency. But the climax wasn't just victory. Harold Finch, once untouchable, faced the public humiliation of exposure. His control over the neighborhood, his manipulation, and his petty vendettas had been laid bare for all to see. Neighbors whispered about fines that would now be reviewed, policies that would be overturned, and a system that had finally been held accountable. Maria felt a surge of vindication, knowing her courage had sparked a revolution in the community. As the crowd dispersed, Harold lingered, pale and muttering under his breath. Maria met his gaze one last time. There was no apology, no concession, just the bitter realization that his reign of fear had ended. Outside, residents began discussing future community projects, eco-friendly initiatives, and transparent governance. The air felt lighter, freer, almost electric with possibility. Maria, though exhausted, smiled faintly. She had entered this battle hoping to protect her lawn and her home, but she had ended up defending something far greater: the rights and voices of her entire neighborhood. And as she walked back down the cul-de-sac, she realized that Willow Creek Estates had changed forever. Harold's shadow, once looming over every garden and driveway, had finally lifted. But even in triumph, a small ripple of tension remained, a reminder that vigilance would always be necessary, and that power, once abused, left traces that needed constant guarding. Maria glanced at the folder in her hand, still filled with evidence. This was not the end, it was a new beginning. And with that, a quiet, determined smile crossed her face. The tension that had gripped Willow Creek Estates for months finally gave way to a sense of cautious relief. Maria Trent stepped out of the community center into the bright afternoon sunlight, feeling the weight of the last few weeks lift off her shoulders. Around her, neighbors were talking animatedly, sharing stories of the election and the exposure of Harold Finch's manipulation. Laughter and chatter, previously rare in the neighborhood, now filled the streets. Victor Ramos, now officially the HOA president, walked alongside Maria, shaking hands with residents and nodding respectfully. He had already announced plans for transparency measures. All fines would be reviewed and justified in writing, neighborhood meetings would be held monthly and recorded for public access, and any future election ballots would be overseen by an independent auditor. The changes were significant, but for Maria, the most powerful transformation was in the community itself. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to repair itself. Families who had been fearful of stepping outside, afraid of being fined or harassed, now worked together on small projects, repainting mailboxes, planting community gardens, and even organizing neighborhood cleanup days. Maria found herself drawn into these projects not just as a participant, but as a trusted advisor, helping neighbors design garden layouts and improve outdoor aesthetics. Her creative skills became a bridge that helped rebuild trust and community spirit, and she felt a deep sense of purpose she hadn't anticipated. The HOA office, once a cold and intimidating space, transformed into a place of transparency. Residents could now attend meetings, access documents online, and speak freely without fear of retaliation. Even Harold Finch, who had remained in the neighborhood for a few weeks after his public humiliation, eventually left quietly. His departure left a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease, reminders of how easily power could be abused, and how quickly fear could spread. The community now carried with it lessons that would not be forgotten. Maria noticed subtle changes in her neighbors too. Linda, the retired schoolteacher who had been one of the first to confide in her, now led a small committee overseeing community landscaping projects. The Kim family, once silenced by fear of fines, organized a weekly kids' playgroup that brought together families across the cul-de-sac. Even previously quiet residents, intimidated by Harold for years, began sharing their own stories, laughing about absurd fines, and suggesting ways to improve neighborhood harmony. The social fabric of Willow Creek Estates was mending, stronger than it had ever been before. Yet the impact went beyond mere social recovery. Maria realized the neighborhood had collectively learned a crucial lesson about accountability. The exposure of Harold Finch's abuses had shown everyone the importance of vigilance, the power of documentation, and the courage required to challenge authority. She found herself mentoring newer residents, explaining how to carefully document HOA interactions, keep records of correspondence, and protect their rights without escalating conflict unnecessarily. The community was no longer a passive body, it had become empowered. The legal repercussions for Harold were also significant. Several residents had filed complaints about his mismanagement and intentional election interference. The local HOA Oversight Committee began reviewing his tenure, evaluating fines, and investigating evidence of potential fraud. Although Harold tried to contest these inquiries, the combined testimony, photographs, and Maria's meticulous documentation left little room for defense. The resolution of these legal matters would take months, but the precedent had been set: abuse of power would not go unchallenged. Maria's personal journey mirrored the neighborhood's transformation. Before the conflict, she had been hesitant, polite, and reserved in community matters, hoping to avoid confrontation. But facing repeated harassment had forced her to cultivate courage, resilience, and strategic thinking. She had learned to stand firm, to gather evidence, and to lead with integrity. Her sense of agency, once dormant, had awakened in a way that enriched not only her life but the lives of everyone around her. The story of Willow Creek Estates began to spread beyond the cul-de-sac. Local news outlets picked up the narrative of the HOA revolt, highlighting how a small, united group of residents had overturned election manipulation and restored fairness to their community. Maria and Victor were invited to speak at neighborhood associations and civic groups, sharing their experience and emphasizing the importance of transparency, documentation, and community solidarity. Their story became a template for others struggling with overbearing HOAs, offering hope and practical guidance.